Well, we'll speak now to economic and political analyst Khaya Sithole for an overview of how things unfolded at Nasrec. Khaya, good to talk to you again. We spoke before the conference and you weren't very optimistic about what might come out. Was that pessimism justified in the end?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. Yeah, I mean, the reason I was a bit pessimistic, unfortunately, did materialize in that in this particular conference, they did indeed run out of time because of the issues relating to the administration and the process of running the elections. So at this point in time, we should have had the full range of conference outcomes and conference resolutions, which would then enable us to be in a position to understand whether the ANC's plan of action for the next 5 years is aligned with what they have said before, also aligned with the current economic realities of our time, and also whether any of it is practical and feasible. So as you now know, because they've deferred the final conference declaration until the beginning of next year, we're still not sure what the final outcome of this conference is in terms of policy. But of course, we do have an idea of what some of the big policy ideas are, the basic income grant being one of them. And of course, it cannot occur in a vacuum. We hope that the ANC has learned this by now, that when you make this particular pronouncements, you need to be able to explain to us exactly how it's going to translate, not only for society to understand what the plan is, but also for the deployees themselves to know exactly what the line of march is. And in far too many instances, the ANC tends to leave society hanging about how things are actually going to be put together. And then 5 years later, we come back and then they simply say, oops, we should have done better there, but nobody actually knew what should have been done in the first place.
When we look at the party leadership, I mean, it's more or less a reformat, but a lot of the same faces, particularly in the top echelons of the party. So the question then becomes, they talk about turning around the economy, but if you've got the same people, what are they going to do differently that they didn't do already?
That is the tricky part. And I think obviously political parties in general, but a political party that's been in power for such a long time in particular, they do tend to struggle with the tension of trying to figure out at what point in time do we acknowledge that particular policy measures or particular policy pronouncements quite simply aren't working or quite simply are not fit for purpose. And then thereafter, how do we then detach ourselves from them and come up with a new plan without running the risk of being discredited by opposition parties and the electorate? And that simply means that the tension is resolved by simply trying to migrate from one policy direction to another without sounding like we're a different party altogether. That's a problem that all political parties that remain in power for a particular period of time tend to have. I think for the ANC in particular, it is a very acute problem in that you may then hear them saying that we're going to do this thing different, we're going to do this thing better. But we do know that part of the problem is that sometimes they don't have the right resource allocation methodology. In other words, they don't deploy the best people to those particular tasks. And in some instances, the best people to be deployed probably aren't within the ANC itself. And that is something that obviously creates tension points within the deployment committee, where the question is, well, if people are so committed to our policy agenda, in other words, our own cadres, why are we getting someone who hasn't made the same commitment? And how do we know that that person is not going to sabotage our policy direction as a party? So that tension point is still not resolved. So unfortunately, when they then say we're going to do better, and then you look at the people that they say are going to run those processes, and they are not only look, but essentially are the same people that were doing it before, it becomes difficult to figure out how they'll cut that umbilical cord and say, this is how we're actually doing things better. So unfortunately, even now, we did not hear the minister or the president in particular saying that, look, in relation to state-owned enterprises, for example, we've tried a particular idea for the past 5 years. It hasn't worked out. We still have an energy crisis. Transnet still can't do what it's supposed to do. So therefore, this is what we're doing decisively differently in order for us to move forward. So right now, it really just sounds like an ambitious plan of action without very little practical implementation ideas.
An indicator of intention might be what a lot of people are looking to is the cabinet that he might choose. We know that probably at least there'll be a new transport minister. But do you think if he's serious about changing things around, that he really does have to do a number on the cabinet?
Luckily for him, a cabinet reshuffle is inevitable for a couple of reasons, the transport minister being one example that you've just cited, but also in the interim over the past 5 years, there have been some ministers that have either lost office or have unfortunately lost their lives that have not been replaced, and also Anna Dlodlo moved to the World Bank and she wasn't replaced. So there is a scope for making particular changes. The big question that we all need to focus on is the question of how dramatic or how drastic those changes are. Does he then wake up and say, after 5 years of having tolerated the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, for example, without getting the right outcomes out, then is it time for me to do things differently? Does he then embark on a process of trying to find some ideological convergence with his own Minister of Mineral Resources, because we do know that they do tend to share widely divergent ideas about the definition of the country's energy security? Does he then have the courage to acknowledge that in spite of how strong an ally Pravin Gordhan has been for him in the past 5 years, it does look like that the scope and the scale of the public enterprises portfolio is quite simply beyond his capacity to manage. So that is what we really should be worried about, because that will obviously tell us whether what he has told us for the past 5 years that he's trying to do, whether he's now able to then use this particular moment to ensure that it doesn't get sabotaged by his own foot soldiers who, through no fault of their own, quite simply and particularly aligned to what he's trying to do, or do not understand the scale and the scope of what needs to be done.
How do you interpret the market's reaction? I got a sense, to be honest, that it was more relief rather than joy.
Look, I'm not a fan of market paranoia, and I've said this from the day of the Des Van Rooyen saga, in that I think it is problematic for us to have a country, or for us to even have a currency whose ability or whose reaction to political upheavals is so drastic, because it simply means that we are a government that is run by personalities rather than by policy pillars. And the reason I say that is that a couple of weeks ago, when there was a rumor that the president was going to resign, you saw what I thought was a remarkably irrational reaction from the market. People then said, oh no, we cannot invest in this economy anymore, because guess what? Didi Mabuza may be president the day after. So I wrote an article last week and say, well, actually that doesn't make sense, because from the moment we left Nasrec in December 2017, David Mabuza has technically been one heartbeat away from being the president of the country. So the problem here is that for as long as you do not feel that the country's institutions are able to withstand political transitions, that is something that we need to deal with. And right now, this idea that we must be relieved because Ramaphosa is a guy that has stayed here, well, this is his last term. In 5 years' time, we're going to have to find someone else. So if it then turns out that in 5 years' time, we then also have this irrational reaction by the markets, where they simply assume that the country's economy is going to fall apart on the basis that Ramaphosa no longer holds the key to the union buildings, I don't think I'm comfortable living in an economy that fragile.
So when we get into the new year, the clock will be ticking. We'll be a year away from an election. And there's always a temptation for politicians to be populist in the way that they do things. Is there a fear that things will be done for votes rather than the long-term benefit of the country?
There is, unfortunately, a very strong risk that the ANC will either be dragged into populism or they'll pursue it themselves. And we do know that one of the populist line of agenda items, if I can call it that, is the question of whether South Africa should have a basic income grant. And the reason I refer to it as a populist agenda item is that you must remember that the ANC has been deliberating on this question for over 20 years. From many, many years ago, as recent as long as ago as 2001, they started commissioning reports on trying to figure out how to ensure long-term income security for a lot of citizens that quite simply aren't ever going to migrate into the economy in its current architecture. So it's not a new conversation for the ANC. What happened with COVID-19 is that because now we were given the unique ability to actually test it on a live scale on many more citizens, and people will see that even after some particular glitches, it eventually works. It becomes quite problematic for any party that is facing an election in 18 months' time, as we stand now, or at any point in time, to then say we're going to withdraw that form of support and we're not going to scale it up, particularly when the basis for having put it together 2 or 3 years ago was to say that people have lost jobs and people's incomes and livelihoods have been threatened by this COVID pandemic. Well, unfortunately, a lot of those people that actually ended up getting the COVID-19 social relief SRD grant are people who still don't have a job, as they didn't have at that point in time. So it will become remarkably difficult for any party to say we're now withdrawing that support as if people now suddenly have jobs. But what you'll also see is that opposition parties will understand that that is an Achilles heel for the ANC, because the ANC will then have to say, well, we'd like to do it, but as the party that's actually in charge of state resources, we are the ones that have to balance the equation of how much is needed versus what resources are available. Other political parties that are not in government do not have to deal with the second question of how it ought to be funded. So they will obviously use this as a line of attack for the ANC to say, look, if we were in power, this is how much we would give you as a basic income grant. If we're in power, this is how we'd ensure better income security. And of course, the ANC, if it says that and then it wins an election, that it has a responsibility to not only say it, but then to implement it. And I think it's inevitable that that's going to be one of the big hot potatoes that we see over the next couple of years. We're also going to have to deal with the questions of the country's energy security issues, because clearly under the ANC's management of the energy portfolio, and from what they said themselves in this particular conference, they just haven't got it right. So you can imagine that opposition parties are going to use that to capitalize. And of course, that then elevates the risk that in a panic mode, the ANC will say things that it itself knows are impractical, because it, unlike opposition parties, is the one that has the responsibility to balance the books. Everyone else has got the ability to simply talk, knowing that they're not responsible for implementation.
What needs to happen in a year for you to sleep well at night?
So many things need to be done very well. But I think what the president needs to start with is to capitalize on the few bright lights of his first term. And the few bright lights of his first term is that he somehow managed to convince many people across the globe that South Africa is an investment destination, anecdotally. What he unfortunately failed to do was to ensure that the landing ground for those investments was as fertile as it needed to be. So we do know that he's been hosting investment summits since 2018, and we always hear about the pledges where billions in rands are mentioned as amounts of money that will flow in provided XYZ happens. The problem is that XYZ hasn't happened, so it is very difficult to imagine that any foreign investor or even local investor is going to start building a brand new factory when they cannot even figure out whether there'll be the electricity, the energy that is required to power that factory, whether they cannot figure out that once they've produced their goods, however they've managed to produce them, whether they'll be able then to get them to the harbor, because Transnet cannot guarantee anything. So until he actually then ensures that the grass is made fertile for all of these pledges that he keeps getting from those particular investors, they will all unfortunately turn out to be meaningless in the long run. So he needs to capitalize on the bright sparks of his first administration. He then needs to also take the courageous position of saying that part of the reason his agenda of his first term was stalled so much is that he quite simply didn't deploy the right people to the difficult and the critical posts that people would make the very difficult and unpopular decisions. And if he can't find them within the party, then he needs to find a way to ensure that those that are within the party are given either the right autonomy or the right strength to be able to ensure that they execute on the president's agenda. When we have this conversation in 5 years' time, this conversation will not be about a minister of XYZ who was put in a particular portfolio and then did not perform. It will be a conversation about the legacy of Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the person who put that person in that particular portfolio and said, please execute on this agenda that I've set out to implement as the president of the party and of the republic. And if that doesn't turn out to be a good story to tell, it's his problem, not a ministerial problem.
Khaya Sithole, always great talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.